September 15th, 2023. The night in Denver was quiet. The streets of the residential neighborhood where John Carter lived were silent, and the lights in the houses were beginning to go out. Inside his own home, John, a respected military police officer, was restless. Sitting on the couch, he looked at the clock as his mind swirled around the past few weeks. Something wasn't right, and he felt it deep in his chest. Emily, his wife of 10 years, had moved on. John noticed how she was more distant, cold. Excuses to leave the house were constant, family dinners had become rare, and eye contact between them was almost non-existent. She said she needed time and space, but John knew there was something more. His instincts, trained to notice signs of danger on the battlefield, were now telling him that he had an enemy at home. But who? That night, Emily said she was going out to meet a friend. One more excuse. John didn't argue, but inside he felt his blood boil. As soon as she left, he decided to act. He took his keys and discreetly followed Emily's car through the streets lit by the dim streetlights. He kept a safe distance, watching every move, every turn. Emily drove for a few minutes until she stopped on a familiar street. It was the home of Mark Reynolds, one of John's closest friends. They served together in the Army, shared stories and experiences. Mark was like a brother to him. Upon seeing Emily enter the house, John felt a tightness in his chest. His heart was beating fast, but his mind was still trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just an innocent visit. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But John's instinct said otherwise. He waited outside, the car engine off, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The minutes seemed like hours, and with every second, doubt turned into certainty. He waited for what seemed like 2 eternities until he saw Emily come out of Mark's house. But she was not alone. Mark followed close behind, and they both laughed at something John couldn't hear. The sight of them together was like a knife piercing his heart. John watched as Emily and Mark hugged. It wasn't a casual hug, it was something more intimate, something he couldn't accept. They shared a quick kiss, but for John, it lasted an eternity. The betrayal was there, before his eyes, naked and raw. His best friend and the wife he loved so much were together behind his back. The pain was instantaneous, but it soon gave way to something darker. Without being noticed, John decided to follow them. The couple got into Mark's car and drove to a secluded location on the edge of a lake on the outskirts of the city. It was a peaceful place, the kind of setting that seemed straight out of a postcard, but now became the scene of a devastating revelation. John parked the car at a distance, leaving without making a sound. He hid among the trees and watched as Emily and Mark continued to kiss, not worrying about who might see them. The silence of the lake contrasted with the turmoil happening inside John. He felt sweat running down his temples, his fists clenched, his nails digging into his palm. Every second that passed took him deeper into a pit of hatred and frustration. Emily's betrayal was unbearable, but that of Mark, her best friend, was simply inconceivable. John was used to facing enemies on the battlefield, but this was different. This enemy had infiltrated his life, his home, without him realizing it. As the couple laughed and cuddled, John thought about all the times he had blindly trusted Mark, how he told him stories about life with Emily, the difficulties and the joys. He trusted Mark as someone who was always by his side, in the trenches, facing the same battles. But now, he saw that Mark had become the most dangerous enemy of all, the one who acts stealthily, destroying everything he loved. John returned to the car with his mind racing. Every detail of the betrayal was now burned into his memory. He knew he couldn't just ignore what he had seen. Emily and Mark had crossed a line from which there was no return. He drove home in silence, with his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel and his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was far away. He started planning. The pain of betrayal gave way to the need for revenge. That night, a decision was made. John would no longer be the betrayed man. He would be the man who would do justice. The city of Denver would no longer be the same after that silent night. The early morning of September 16th seemed normal to most people in Denver, but not to John Carter. He was awake, sitting in his kitchen with a glass of whiskey in his hands, staring into space. The images of Emily and Mark together replayed in his mind like an endless horror movie. The betrayal, the complicit laughter, the kiss. Every detail caused the hatred within him to grow more and more. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. For hours, John remained there, silent, thinking about what he would do. He was a trained man, a soldier with extensive experience in combat operations. But this battle wasn't physical, it was emotional, personal, and it was the hardest he had ever faced. There was a struggle between his pain and his anger, between the desire to confront and the impulse to punish. When the clock on the wall ticked just after 3 in the morning, John made a decision. He could no longer live with that betrayal consuming his soul. I couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. At that moment, he became convinced that he needed to do something. There was no more room for dialogue, explanations, or reconciliation. The damage was already done. John slowly got up, walked to the bedroom, and opened the dresser drawer. Inside was his service weapon, something he had promised himself to only use to protect his family or on duty. But that morning, he broke that promise. He picked up the gun and, with frightening calm, loaded it. Every movement was precise, controlled. There was no hesitation in his actions. Still under the cover of night, John left the house and got into the car, driving once again towards Mark's house. The streets were deserted, and the silence outside contrasted with the internal chaos he was experiencing. The car radio was off, which only intensified the sound of his heavy, controlled breathing. When he arrived at Mark's house, John parked a little ways away, making sure no one noticed him. He knew they would both be there. Emily wouldn't come home that night, and neither would Mark, her betrayer. The house was dark, except for a faint light that escaped the curtains of the second-floor bedroom. They were together, sleeping in the same bed where John had slept on so many visits and parties. Mark's house was a second home to him, but that night, it was the scene of his revenge. John approached the house silently, as if he were on a military mission. He had invaded places before, but never with such a personal motivation. Every step he took was carefully planned. Every sound he heard was filtered through his focused mind. He reached the back door and found it unlocked, as if it had been waiting for him. Entering the house, John felt no fear, just an unshakable coldness. The hallway leading to the room seemed endless, but he walked with determination, his gun firmly in hand. He knew what he was about to do, and for him, there was no other alternative. When he reached the bedroom door, he stopped for a moment. On the other side, the muffled sounds of calm breathing echoed through the dark room. John took a deep breath, gathered his strength, and slowly opened the door. The scene in front of him made his heart stop for a moment. Emily and Mark were lying in bed, sound asleep. They looked so innocent, so vulnerable, like nothing could touch them there. For anyone else, perhaps it was a time to reflect, to reconsider what was about to happen. But for John, it was just confirmation that he was about to do what he felt was necessary. With gun in hand, he approached the bed. Their breathing, which had previously seemed soft, was now deafening to him. Emily, the woman with whom he had shared so many moments of joy and pain, lay there, with the man he had once called his brother. Anger consumed him. He knew that after that night, there would be no going back. Without warning, John raised the gun. The first bullet was fired quickly, hitting Mark directly in the chest. He woke up with a start, but before he could understand what was happening, the second bullet found its target, ending his life in a matter of seconds. Emily woke up in a panic to the sound of gunshots. His eyes widened when he saw John standing there, holding the gun. She tried to speak, tried to say something, but there were no words that could calm the hatred in John's eyes. He approached her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Perhaps in that moment, John saw the woman he once loved. But the moment passed quickly, and he pulled the trigger once more. The silence that followed was suffocating. John stood there, looking at the lifeless bodies in front of him. He had destroyed everything. What was left now? The pain didn't go away as he expected. On the contrary, it seemed like it had increased. But he knew there was no going back. John descended the stairs with heavy steps, each step seeming more difficult than the last. He left through the back door the same way he came in, silent but this time feeling the weight of what he had done. Dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon, and with it, the certainty that his life, from that moment on, was irreparably destroyed. The night that had begun in silence turned into a nightmare for John Carter. After committing the murders, he felt trapped in a distorted reality, as if the world around him was out of control. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and every second after the shots sounded like a countdown to the end of his life. He was no longer the respectable man, the dedicated military policeman. Now, he was a killer, a man who had crossed the point of no return. As he walked through Mark's house, leaving behind the lifeless bodies of his wife and his best friend, John was in a state of shock. Everything was dark, and the shadows of dawn seemed to close around him. The absolute silence was deafening, but his mind was in a whirl. He could barely process what he had done, but he knew that life as he knew it was over here, in that house. John walked out the back door and got into the car, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Denver, his mind replaying the crime scene like a macabre movie. The city looked different now. The familiar had become strange. The streets he knew so well, the houses he protected as part of his job, now seemed distant, as if he were in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had no destination, he just drove. The whiskey he had drunk before the tragedy now seemed to blur his vision, but the adrenaline kept him alert. The road seemed endless, every kilometer a new layer of guilt forming inside. The weight of what he had done was unbearable. He had killed the two people closest to him, destroyed his life in a moment of uncontrollable rage. There was no escape. After driving for hours, John stopped in a secluded alley, far from the city lights. There, he turned off the car and sat in silence, just listening to his own labored breathing. The gun was still in his lap, a physical and inescapable reminder of his actions. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police discovered what had happened. They would come after him, and he wouldn't be able to get away. He was a police officer, knew how things worked. As dawn began to brighten the sky, reality finally hit home. John felt despair take root deep in his chest. There was nowhere to run, no way to justify what he had done. Emily and Mark's betrayal now seemed distant, an echo of a life he no longer belonged to. The hatred that had guided him during the night dissipated, giving way to a deep, suffocating emptiness. John took out his cell phone and stared at the screen. I knew I would need to make a call, but to whom? There was no one he could call. He had no one else. The thought of calling the police crossed his mind. Maybe he should turn himself in, get it over with. But something inside him couldn't accept this idea. He thought about his years of service, about all the extreme situations he had faced as a police officer and soldier. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for that night. The war was different. On the battlefield, there were rules, there were identifiable enemies. Here, the enemy was himself. He had become the monster he swore to fight. In an act of desperation, John picked up the gun once more and held it tightly. His mind was dark, confused, and he pondered the final end. Maybe it was the only way. He raised the gun toward his own head, the cold metal pressing against his temple. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage he needed to finish what he had started. But then, something made him stop. Maybe it was fear of the unknown, or maybe a last spark of self-preservation. He slowly lowered the gun and placed it back on the passenger seat. There was still a part of John that wasn't ready to give up completely, despite everything he had done. Maybe it was the survival instinct that had been burned into him by years of training, or maybe it was just the fear of facing what came next. The sky began to lighten, announcing a new day. But for John, there were no more normal days. He knew he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The thought of returning home, of facing the police and his own conscience, was overwhelming. But there was no other option. He picked up his cell phone again and, with shaking hands, dialed a number. It was his police supervisor's number. The call only rang a few times before being answered. "Carter, is that you?" The voice on the other end sounded worried. "What happened? You're gone." John took a deep breath, trying to find the words. I did a terrible thing," he finally said, his voice low and full of pain. "I need help." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but to John, it felt like an eternity. He knew that, From that moment on, there was no way to escape. The night of hell was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. The police would come. He would be arrested. His career, his life, everything he had built was destroyed. But for some reason, at that moment, he felt a small sense of relief. The hell inside his mind would continue to torment him, but at least he wouldn't be alone anymore. The truth, dark and brutal, was now exposed, and there was no turning back. The sun finally rose above the horizon, and with it, sirens began to echo through the city streets. The sun had already risen above the horizon when John Carter was finally found by the police. He was sitting in the driver's seat of his car, his face haggard, his eyes staring into space, as if he had completely lost connection with reality. The approaching sirens brought him back to the present, but the sense of relief he felt upon making the call the night before was gone. Now there was only the crushing weight of what was to come. When the first police cars arrived, they quickly surrounded the area. John didn't react. He knew it was useless to try anything. Instead, he just raised his hand slowly, without making any sudden movements. The police officers, his colleagues in uniform, got out of the cars cautiously, pointing their weapons at him, as if they were about to confront a dangerous criminal. But the truth was that John was already defeated. "John Carter, exit the vehicle with your hands up," shouted one of the officers, his voice echoing in the silent alley. John obeyed without hesitation. He opened the car door slowly, getting out with his hands raised. He felt everyone's eyes on him, as if he were naked before the judgment of his own colleagues. He was no longer one of them. He was no longer the respected and admired police officer. He was a killer. When the police handcuffed him, John did not resist. The cold metal of the cuffs on his wrists was a painful reminder of what he had become. His head was bowed, the weight of shame preventing him from looking at any of the men who were now escorting him to the police car. He knew some of them. He had fought alongside them, saved lives together. Now he was just a traitor, a man who destroyed his own life in an act of desperation and madness. The next few hours were a blur for John. He was taken to the police station, where he went through the formal arrest process. The questions began, but he could barely hear what was being said. His mind was stuck on the night before, replaying the events on an endless loop. What he had done was real, irrevocable, and now he would have to deal with the consequences. In the cold, cramped cell, John finally had a moment of solitude. He sat on the concrete bench, his shaking hands resting on his knees. The silence of the prison was almost as oppressive as the weight of guilt on his mind. The images of Emily and Mark, lying on the ground, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and surprise, haunted every second of his thoughts. He had ended their lives, destroyed everything they had once held dear. The time in the cell seemed to stretch indefinitely. John lost track of the hours, the days. Every minute was an eternity, and with every beat of his heart, he wondered if he had the strength to endure what was to come. He knew he would be tried, convicted, and would probably spend the rest of his life behind bars. What he didn't know was how to deal with the pain that consumed him inside. Newspapers quickly began circulating the news. Military police officer involved in double homicide was in the headlines all over the news in Denver and across the country. The media explored every sordid detail of the story. The secret affair between his wife and his best friend, the betrayal that led to John's breakdown, the deadly shooting that ended it all. He became the town's villain, a symbol of the madness that can arise from uncontrollable rage. During interrogations, John remained silent most of the time. He knew there were no excuses, nothing that could justify what he had done. When he was finally asked why he killed Emily and Mark, he only replied in a low voice, almost as if talking to himself, "I loved them, but they destroyed everything." These words echoed in the interrogation room, but they made no impact whatsoever. There was no way to fix what was done, no way to go back in time and undo that fateful night. The trial was quick. Prosecutors painted John as a man out of control, a police officer who had lost his mind and turned murderer. The defense tried unsuccessfully to argue that John's mental state was compromised by the shocking betrayal, but no one wanted to hear justifications. The public cried out for justice. John was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He knew this would be his sentence before he even entered the courtroom. There was no surprise, just grim resignation. When the verdict was read, he did not react. He just bowed his head and accepted his fate. Back in his cell after the trial, John spent the days in silence, reflecting on how everything had come to this. He wondered where exactly he had lost control, where the love he had for Emily and the friendship with Mark had turned to hate. But the answers never came. He was trapped in a spiral of regret and pain. Life in prison was hard, but John was no longer afraid. For him, the real hell wasn't in the concrete walls or the metal bars. The real hell was inside his mind, in the memories that haunted him day and night. He has become a shadow of the man he once was, lost in a world of endless darkness. And so John Carter's life ended, not with a scream, but with the silence of a man who had lost everything.